iteration of our ongoing series, Basic Notions of Metaphysics, we'll try to demonstrate in one example how some basic notions of metaphysics get inverted in our day and age. So we won't go too much into detail about the term, that is to say notion, that we'll use as an example. That would take us too far, so we'll cut it short. The term we'll use in this case will be the notion of infinity or the infinite, sometimes also defined as absolute, although absolute is not really such a convenient term. And so what is, first of all, what is infinity? What is infinite? To give it a most simple definition, it would be that which nothing greater can be conceived. That is to say, it is something that in Platonism was called dynamis panton, all power. Would be the best translation, I think, because literally this means possibility of all, but it is very important to have a right notion of possibility in mind when we talk about this, because these terms, when used in ancient and medieval context, have a quite different meaning than they have today. And they tend to be used in very different, sometimes even seemingly opposite ways. Because infinity, why am I saying this? Because infinity is something that is to be understood primarily as actual. And we all know that actual and potential are kind of opposites, congenial opposites. But in this case, when actuality or energy or reality is understood in an absolute sense, it coincides with an absolute possibility, that is to say, in the sense of absolute active power. So in a different sense, absolute possibility would be absolute matter, would be something that is absolutely, to a greatest extent possible, inert and amorphous, whereas in this context it means something that is in absolute sense actual, real, active and formed, not amorphous. One good way to think about infinity would be, and I'm just giving this as a hint because it doesn't 100% coincide with what we mean here by infinity, is so-called ontological proof of God's existence, that is usually related to Anselm of Canterbury. And it goes like this, that God is, although let us say infinity and God are not identical terms, but infinity or eternity is a quality that we necessarily use when you think about God. God is something of that nothing great, from which nothing greater can be conceived, and as such, if there is nothing greater, no greater concept or no greater idea one can have, it has to contain in it reality. So the very fact of thinking the perfect implies that perfect is real. And at the first glance, for beginners in philosophy, this seems rather naive or like paralogism, but in fact it is not. The reason it is not naive, and we'll leave aside the question, is this really a proof of God's existence, or is it something, or rather something telling us, let's say, telling us something about God's quality or what can be known of God. this necessary inference, because it is logically necessary, in fact, is quite normal and natural when we think about in metaphysical terms. Because, as we said, infinity is that from which and of which nothing greater can be conceived. It is the absolute maximum. And when we deal with infinity in everyday language or in sciences today, mostly natural sciences, we do have a preconceived notion of it. If Anselm's so-called proof was just a paralogism or sophism, well, this would mean that we would have to check out the way the mathematics thinks about infinity, or physics, or such sciences, because all of them take this notion from the mind. They are not, it is maybe hard to wrap your mind around this. Because in natural sciences there is this illusion that, at least in epistemology of them, that these notions they use are somehow empirically derived from experience. But this is impossible. These notions cannot be found in experience. That is, the basis for them can be found, but the definitions of them cannot. Because for definitions of such metaphysical terms that transcend everything, you have, in the sense, you have to have a kind of pure mental act. And in ancient times and in medieval times, this was understood as intellection, as the act of congeniality of mind and being. We spoke about this in the context of speaking about the teaching doctrine of transcendentals. That mind and being are convertible. I won't go deep into it because I was talking and writing about it ad nauseam. I'll just reference it. This congeniality and convertibility, which means that mind is being, in a way, and the being is mind, in a way, or mindful, intelligible, is at the basis of the existence of notions as infinity. So we can distort these notions. For instance, we can say that Anselmo, for instance, maybe pushed it too far, because speaking of infinity and speaking of God, as triune God, about whom he was speaking about, is not really something you should do. But to say that this is a paralogism, that it is a logical petitio principii, where you introduce the quality of to something real because your mind forces you to have this quality in the notion of that real thing, is not valid. Because real thing in this sense is not this or that, but all. And interestingly enough, about such lofty objects as all, pan in Greek, as the all-encompassing reality, we in fact can use concepts that are not empirically derived. And mind you, empiricism does not mean experience. It means metaphysics, that system of metaphysics that reduces everything that can be known to a specific notion of collating the sense data. The sense data in itself is not the fact that we know things through senses, that we use senses knowledge, does not have to do anything with empiricism. It's just a fact. But empiricism interprets this fact in a certain manner. So infinity, what we see at the first sight in the concept of infinity, well, I would say that we can note that infinity is not a quantifier, that it is not a term of quantity, that it is primarily not a mathematical term. The reason for this is because infinity transcends every category of being. It transcends number, because something can be, at least theoretically, infinitely beautiful. Something can be infinitely good. Something can be infinitely great or infinitely small. Interestingly enough, it is very arguable, can we have infinite quantity? Can we have infinite number, for example? And this is where inversion gets in. For instance, today, if you would like to talk about infinity, most likely you will be talking about quantifiable infinity. That is to say that something can spread in infinite division, for instance, or in infinite space. Now we understand the world today as an infinite space. That is to say, the space that is understood in some details in this or that way, but that is mostly unimaginable, but empirically supposedly visible, infinity of vacuum, of emptiness, of empty space filled with matter, with scraps of matter, let's say. This is most emphatically not infinity. This is not infinite, this is indefinite. The reason for this is simple. Now, I wouldn't go too far into mathematics, but I'll use one example, because this is metaphysics defending its terms. And while we stand on the grounds of metaphysics, we are at liberty to use exclusively metaphysical method of analysis. And now I'll use it. When we say that number is infinite, we are saying nonsense. Number, that is to say, number in the infinite sense is only number in indefinite sense, because number is a series that is always enlarged by adding units. It is the series of units. Now, of course, in modern mathematics you have fractures and fractals and whatnot, but basis of mathematics is a quantifiable or unit of quantity. This is not infinity, because the infinity would imply that there is an end to series of increase or decrease. And what we can see in category of quantity, this is something that is never achieved, because in the category of quantity, and mind you, I'm talking metaphysics. Mathematics cannot escape this. This is metaphysical foundation category. This is the category that is built upon a discrete unit of quantity or the extension of quantity. Unit goes in series, extension is in extending, and extension is infinitely divisible, whereas the discrete unit or number is not infinitely invisible in its essence, if taken in itself, but it can be infinitely enlarged by adding other units. This most certainly is not infinity. It is the indefiniteness. Now, why I'm saying that this is inversion? It is inversion because there is a kind of congeniality to these two terms. You cannot imagine indefinite without imagining infinity. But you can think infinity without imagining indefinite. Obviously, analogy is based on infinity, not on indefiniteness. Now, analogy implies, when we compare two terms, this congeniality that is shared by both of them. It can be in third term, to which both relate, or it can be a quality or qualification of their essence that they share, which is causally related to third term, not analogically. I'll explain what I mean in a second. So, both infinity and indefiniteness have something in common, and this is the maximality, the greatness above which nothing can be conceived, the maximum. But infinity expresses this quality most perfectly, while indefiniteness imitates it, because in indefiniteness, the perpetuity or the totality or the infinite is a negation of finitude. It's a negative term, whereas in infinity it is the actual term, because the very notion of infinity by itself discloses this fact that everything is encompassed by it. While in indefinite it is not the case. It is something that is put forward as a kind of ideal, as the last term of this bad infinity, let's call it, with Hegel. Now, why this analogy does not require third term of analogy? Because third term is something that is incommensurably higher from both. Third term is a cause. So analogy helps us to see the likeness, causal likeness between two, so we can see that infinity and indefinite are congenial in some sense, but only participation in the cause can disclose why is this so and why they are analogous. And their relation to cause is not analogous relation, it's a participatory relation, that is to say they exist only insofar as the cause exists. In this sense, this would be existence of, in metaphysical terms, first principle, in more proper humane terms, of God. Because infinity is let's say quality of God, as also congenial term eternity. And mind you, eternity is not simply something that is a paradigm for time. There is a far deeper meaning to eternity than just eternal time, because eternity implies power. Also, it implies some other qualities that are not necessarily implied in time. So we see, for instance, to get back to infinity, the things that infinity necessarily entails and qualities that are necessary coming with notion of infinity are not really necessary in the notion of indefiniteness. So it can be redefined in a sense. It can be used in many ways. It can be in fact specialized. And what happened with this inversion is that original metaphysical term was not rejected, as modern philosopher and postmodern philosophers like to tell you. They didn't reject infinity by realizing that it is a meaningless wordplay, as Wittgenstein or some of his ilk would say, or wordplay or meaningless misuse of language. No. It is not. It is just that they took it and put it out of its original context in the context of specialized sciences that are dealing with a certain determinate category of being. And this category, I would say, with René Guénon, and those in the know about René Guénon know that this is partly based on his book, Metaphysics of Infinitesimal Calculus. It's a very good book. That this category of quantity. So what I wanted to show here, what was the main reason, is that losing metaphysics and abandoning traditional thought, abandoning natural thought, I would say, what we were created for, created for, is not a total abandon. It's not leaving it into nothingness, proving it to be chimera of our mind, but inverting it, but applying it to something that is infinitely lower than it, like fixing your gaze. If your gaze is supposed to be fixed before you, now you have to eternally fix it at your feet and walk like that through life. And this tells us something about the reality of those terms, because they are obviously not something that you can quote unquote deconstruct. Because if this was the case, we wouldn't be using them anymore. When someone would say that using the terms as infinite, as beautiful, even as one, as being, in a metaphysical sense, if they would say that this is senseless, they wouldn't use them at all. But they do use them. And they use them in different contexts, trying to apply the metaphysical rules to this context. Because, after all, if we are talking of infinite numbers or infinite extensions and such things, we are, in a way, talking metaphysically, because nobody ever saw anything like that. Because sensual experience, has an inherent finitude in it. It has an inherent limit. It is limited by the body that enacts the sense cognition. Empiricism is not built on this. It is intellectual, because only intellect can build something like a metaphysical notion. In this sense, a self-contradictory thing, metaphysical system, because there is no such thing. But empiricism is a metaphysical system. It is an attempt to shrink what is boundless into one whole that can be overpowered by the knower. So you can have system of empiricism, and by this system, any kind of knowledge you get, you can judge is it true or not by recurring to this system. For instance, very simple example, if a miracle should occur, and this miracle would be witnessed by tens of thousands of people, and these things happened, and at least half of those people being total skeptics, and seeing this miracle, and this miracle is such that it cannot be, no way it can be explained, no way it can be ruled out as a delusion. It was, for instance, it was announced that it will happen on certain days, certain hour. Empiricism helps you to put it out of your mind, because it says it is impossible, because metaphysical systems of modernity are trying to circumscribe the boundaries of the possible, the boundaries of infinity. And of course, because you cannot circumscribe and you cannot imprison infinity, you invert it to indefiniteness. So you can say, for instance, that there is no possibilities out of sense experience, no possibility of not only knowing but of existing. Because, for instance, Kant, who went out with this idea most clearly, he didn't say, for instance, that it is impossible that something suprasensual exists. Moreover, he was convinced that it exists, but that we cannot know anything about it. But the notion we live under now, and upon which everything is built, or everything is ruined, or brought to deconstruction, is precisely that there is nothing, no worlds beyond worlds, as Nietzsche would say, backworlds, Hinterwelten. This is the assumption. This is the metaphysical assumption, and inside this closed aquarium of being, the only infinity that is possible is indefiniteness of for instance, extending, or indefiniteness of history, of evolution, of things that are moving always in the infinity that cannot be that never can be reached, whereas original notion of infinity is that infinity is reached in itself. It is pre-existing. It is not something that comes to pass, but everything that comes to pass unfolds from it. And there are, of course, different ways to look upon this, and we, of course, won't get into it. So this is the inversion. And it is very interesting in looking at this to conclude that inversion is, in fact, the true name of the game when we are talking about deconstructions or abandoning traditional thought, this or that. It's always not about abandoning it, but appropriating it, by stealing it, about stealing it, and using it for your own purposes. Of course, this is the not real theft of infinite, because you cannot finite human being cannot do this, but it is an obfuscation. It is a creation of a cosmic illusion, of illusion in which whole humankind, taken as a human public, can live. So let us say this would be enough for this segment. Hope you enjoyed it, and as always, thank you for any support to our channel, to our project and website. Hopefully you will continue it. Times are trying, and we could use some material support. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malić of Kalić.